Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at diffusion. Cells need to take in certain substances that a cell desires from their surroundings, and they need to get rid of undesired substances. The desired substances could be something like glucose and oxygen, and the undesired substances could be something like carbon dioxide. In addition to holding the cell together, the cell membrane controls what substances enter and leave a cell. Only small molecules can pass through a cell membrane. Oxygen, glucose, amino acids, and water can pass through a cell membrane. However, larger molecules such as starch and proteins are unable to pass through the membrane as they are too large. We say that the cell membrane is partially permeable, and that means that it lets through certain substances, like the small substances like oxygen, glucose, amino acids, and it doesn't let through other substances, which are the larger substances such as starch and proteins. Substances can enter or leave a cell in three different ways. These ways are diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. Today we're going to be looking at diffusion, and osmosis and active transport are going to be looked at in the next sections. So what actually is diffusion? Diffusion is the net movement of particles from a place where there is a high concentration of them to a place where there is a lower concentration of them. It is the net movement down a concentration gradient. Down a concentration gradient just means that the particles are moving from a place where there's a high concentration of them to a place where there's a lower concentration of them. But why does diffusion occur? It occurs because of the kinetic energy of particles, and it happens in both liquids and gases. It happens in liquids and gases because the molecules in these two states move around randomly, whereas in solids the particles are in a fixed position and therefore they are not able to move. So let's have an example of diffusion. We're going to use the example of someone spraying deodorant or perfume in a room. After the perfume has been sprayed, the perfume particles will be concentrated around where it was sprayed, and there will be no perfume particles on the other side of the room. However, over time the perfume particles will diffuse through the air in the room, and there will be an equal concentration of perfume particles around the room. Another example of diffusion is when we pour squash into a cup of water. As soon as we pour squash into a cup of water, there will be a high concentration of squash particles in the part of the water where we've just poured the squash into. There will be a low concentration of squash particles in the rest of the water. Over time, diffusion will occur, and the squash particles will move from a place where they are in a high concentration to a place where they are in a low concentration, and this will lead to an equal concentration of squash throughout the whole liquid. With squash, diffusion occurs very quickly, but if you have a glass of water and then you pour some squash into it, you'll be able to see diffusion taking place. So let's bring diffusion back to cells. When a cell is respiring, it is using glucose and oxygen to create energy, water, and carbon dioxide. The concentration of oxygen in the cell will be lower than outside the cell, and this is because the cell is turning oxygen and glucose into carbon dioxide and water, and then also producing energy. So let's first have a look at diffusion for oxygen with respect to cells. So here we have a diagram. The purple dashed line is the cell membrane, and it's partially permeable. It means that some substances are able to pass through it and other substances are unable to pass through it. We also have the inside of a cell, which is the right hand side, and we also have the outside of a cell, which is the left hand side. We are looking at diffusion with respect to oxygen, and all the orange circles are oxygen particles. Oxygen is able to pass both ways through the cell membrane. We say that the cell membrane is permeable to oxygen. All of the oxygen particles are moving around in random directions because of the kinetic energy that they possess, and some of the oxygen particles will cross from outside the cell to inside the cell, and inside the cell to outside the cell. We can also look at the concentration of oxygen both inside the cell and outside the cell. From the diagram we can see that there is a greater concentration of oxygen outside the cell compared with inside the cell. This means that there's going to be more oxygen particles moving from outside the cell to inside the cell, which is a rightwards direction, and less oxygen particles moving from inside the cell to outside the cell, which is a leftwards direction. Therefore, we can say that there is a net inflow of oxygen from outside the cell to inside the cell caused by diffusion. so the net movement is in a rightwards direction. We're now going to have a look at the same process but with carbon dioxide. The concentration of carbon dioxide inside the cell will be greater than the concentration outside the cell. This is because carbon dioxide is produced inside the cell during respiration. The carbon dioxide molecules move around randomly, and carbon dioxide is able to pass through the cell membrane in both directions, both from inside the cell to outside the cell and from outside the cell to inside the cell. As there is a greater concentration of carbon dioxide inside the cell compared with outside the cell, more carbon dioxide molecules will move out of the cell than into the cell. This results in a net movement of carbon dioxide molecules outside of the cell. Now we're going to look at what affects the rate of diffusion. The rate of diffusion depends on three different factors. The first factor is temperature, whereby the higher the temperature is, the faster the rate of diffusion. This is because the diffusing particles have more kinetic energy at higher temperatures and are therefore moving around quicker. This means that the diffusing substance reaches an equal concentration in a shorter period of time. If the temperature is lower, it means that the particles have less kinetic energy, and this results in them moving around more slowly. This causes the rate of diffusion to fall and the time it takes for an equal concentration to increase. Another factor that affects the rate of diffusion is the concentration gradient, whereby the steeper the concentration gradient is, the greater the rate of diffusion. This is because more particles from the high concentration part will be moving to the low concentration part, and fewer particles will be moving in the opposite direction, from the lower concentrating part to the higher concentrating part. For example, if the concentration of oxygen was very high outside the cell and very low inside the cell, many oxygen particles will move into the cell and few particles will move out. This results in a high rate of diffusion. The final factor that affects the rate of diffusion is the surface area to volume ratio, whereby the larger the surface area to volume ratio, the greater the rate of diffusion. This brings us to the end of this video. For more content, quizzes and past papers, go on to www.elevise.co.uk.